Thank you very much for having me today, and to the members of CSW, and especially to Jen for organizing today's great conference. Today I'm going to talk to you about coffee, the coffee portion of our panel. And I'm curious, how many in the room are coffee drinkers? That means that coffee is quite popular in this room as it is around the globe. So I'm sorry to tell you that coffee prices are going to go up. And this is sad news for consumers. But unfortunately, many farmers won't see an increase in their wages from the increase in global prices. So there was some speculation in August 2010 around coffee, very similar to what happened with wheat several years ago. And so we'll see speculators or investors making money from the increased price in coffee, but not the coffee farmers themselves. And this has to do with the collapse of the International Coffee Agreement in 1989. And today I'm going to talk to you about fair trade, which is one economic response to the collapse of an international agreement that sets a base standard for coffee, for green coffee. And this fair trade program is called Café Femenino. The title of my paper is Transcaffeinated, Transgender Phenomena and Café Femenino's Fair Trade Femininities. I want to ask, what happens when male financial control of femininity is erased from the picture and not replaced with financial control by women from the global north? Café Femenino, I argue, disrupts normative gender because women from the global south, women who are frequently and uniformly described as poor, abused, indigenous, mothers, and farmers, these women flipped the rescue narrative on its head. Newspaper stories citing battered North American women's gratitude towards Peruvian women coffee farmers calls into question global North and South patterns of dependency and aid, as well as racist assumptions about the relative importance of wealthy white women in resolving economic disparity. Café Femenino is a brand of women-grown, organic, certified fair trade coffee, first harvested in Peru in 2004. This was designed with typical liberal feminist and women in development aims in mind, to give social, legal, and economic rights to women, to reduce gender-based violence, to provide a stable income for women and their families, and to change gender dynamics to benefit girls. And all of these effects are supposed to take place in Peru, right, not in the United States. According to Café Femenino's website, the root of problems for Café Femenino's coffee farmers is not structural violence or legacies of colonization and exploitation, but a combination of poverty, patriarchal machismo, and an unpredictable coffee market. Café Femenino's solution was to create a coffee supply chain in which power is held by women, and only women, at every stage, so from the farmer to the importer to the coffee roaster, but anyone can drink it. You don't have to be one. This agreement is so strict that women farmers must prove ownership of land in their own name in order to participate, and North American roasters must sign a pre-agreement to the agreement that only a woman from the company will sign the actual contract purchasing Café Femenino coffee. The coffee is also, the green coffee is put in bags and then tied with a pink ribbon and passed from women to women transnationally. So this is a very feminine coffee. It's what they're trying to protect it from male economic control, which I find fascinating. We'll come back to this. One of the aspects of Café Femenino is that it's never blended with other coffees, and it's sold under the Café Femenino label with the logo intact. And this actually became a problem with Trader Joe's. In Los Angeles, Trader Joe's sold Café Femenino coffee until fairly recently. And as you know, Trader Joe's will take private labels and put it under the Trader Joe's label. And they couldn't come to quite the right agreement with Café Femenino. So it was still called Café Femenino coffee, but they didn't keep the logo intact. And for that reason, they've since discontinued the Café Femenino coffee in Trader Joe's stores in Los Angeles, in case you're wondering where it went. You can still buy it elsewhere. Café Femenino is considered a success story, supporting more than 1,500 farmers in 6 countries and selling about 500,000 bags of green coffee each year. News accounts and the documentary Strong Coffee describe reduced gender-based violence and increased economic dependence. And yet, as we know from Stephanie's paper, these claims are not new for women in development, right? And they're not new for women's organic or fair trade coffee cooperatives. And so today, I want to talk about the ways Cafe Femenino is different from other women's coffee cooperatives, particularly how its strict women-only business model has the unexpected effect of disrupting binary gender and global north-south power relations through the transnational production of what I call fair trade femininities. I argue that the category women fractures precisely because the kinds of women involved in Cafe Femenino appear to be the same in every kind of media representing them, whether this is news or advertising or the documentary. Yet the economic framework of Cafe Femenino, so going back to this contractual agreement of women only selling coffee to other women, makes it possible to engender multiple representations of femininity. The pay-it-forward element to Cafe Femenino is significant in producing multiple femininities in this economic arrangement. I argue that Cafe Femenino is a transgender phenomenon, what Susan Stryker defines broadly as, quote, anything that disrupts or denaturalizes normative gender, and which calls our attention to the processes through which normativity is produced and atypicality achieves visibility. I read Cafe Femenino's normative representations of femininity in layers, in which the very repetition of characters, so the farmer, the importer, the roasters, and what are called the pay-it-forward recipients, reveals the processes by which we recognize these types of women as normalized. Further, small differences in these representations of normative femininity become glaring and act as a disruption to what we think we know about women, particularly women's agency in business in different geographic and economic spaces. So back to the pay-it-forward element. This is something that the Cafe Femenino women farmers came up with themselves. And what they said was that when they put together their contract, any roaster in North America who buys the green coffee not only has to give a portion of proceeds back to Cafe Femenino, so they pay for the coffee, they pay for the fact that it's organic, and they pay for the fact that it's fair trade. And they pay for one more thing. And this pay-it-forward aspect means that roasters have to give a certain portion of proceeds, so about 5%, to a women's shelter or halfway house in their home community. So what we have are women coffee farmers from the global south supporting poor women or women who've been abused in the global north. I find this fascinating. The news reports vary in their representation of the women in the halfway houses or in the shelters and how they experience the money from Cafe Femenino. So when we think that the typical plot is that of women in the global north initiating and reinforcing needs for social and economic change in the lives of women in the global south, Cafe Femenino fails to complete this narrative when we consider the inception of its business plan resides with women farmers. Surprising gender representations occur in slightly different accounts of a blonde pay-it-forward recipient in the US and a woman of color pay-it-forward recipient in Canada. Faith, who is described by one journalist as, quote, grabbing her children and running from their abusive father 2 years ago, is a resident of Dorothy Place, a halfway house for abused women and children in Bellingham, Washington. Faith cries while watching a slideshow about Cafe Femenino farmers, and she later relates how meaningful it is that the women at the other end of the Americas are, quote, like her, unquote. Mothers who've experienced violence, poverty, and a sense of hopelessness. While Faith's race is not mentioned, she is described as thin and blonde, as someone who made poor choices around alcohol, drugs, and men. Through emphasizing similarities of abuse and dependency in Faith and the Cafe Femenino women, I'm out of order. The journalist gives the impression that some other female intermediary, perhaps the women coffee roasters or the importer, serve as saviors of both categories of women, both the farmers and the women in North America in the shelters. And this ignores the decisive role that Cafe Femenino farmers played in requiring the pay-it-forward action of the North American roasters in the first place. Yet, a brief narrative of a homeless woman of color from Vernon, British Columbia, Canada, and the documentary Strong Coffee breaks the emphasis on abuse as individualized violence, instead calling attention to structural forms of violence. This patron of Vernon Women's Center has dark eyes, dark hair, and she's quite thoughtful in the documentary. She says, quote, "There's just barriers everywhere. It's not just being homeless. It's coming from an abusive relationship, a bad family. You can't get a job if you don't look like you got it together. There's all kinds of reasons." Unquote. This moment is significant as the only media representation of abused North American women as either intelligent or emotionally strong. If we read this narrative against the Café Femenino contract, in which the coffee farmers are responsible for aid provided to North American women in the shelters, the homogenized depiction of the women coffee farmers as abused and in need of rescue by Northern white women is broken. Brisson spoke with the woman from the shelter in Canada. Her presence in strong coffee provides enough of an alternative narrative about women in the shelters that it disrupts the perverse idea that white women are necessary for saving women of color. In conclusion, Café Femenino provides a fascinating case study for understanding the construction of multiple femininities under fair trade, a fracturing of women made possible precisely because Café Femenino's mandates rely on strictly binaristic gender separation, these brittle categories of male and female that break down under fair trade's repetitive and familiar marketing stories about gender, dependency, geography, and aid. And what's fascinating about Café Femenino is that once men can actually buy the coffee, right, we don't have to protect these feminine seeds anymore. And yet there are exceptions that are made, such as one self-described queen who is allowed to sign the contract because he's a one-man roasting operation. So when we investigate transgender phenomena in Café Femenino's coffee chain, it produces plastic possibilities within fair trade femininities. Thank you.